Next amendment, Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Clerk will read.
This is Lee Amendment.
Two amendments.
Lee
is
Amendment
number one.
number
The
one.
amendment one.
An amendment offered by Ms. Lee in Section
Ask for
810.
unanimous consent.
Consider it done, and your gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is very simple. It would strike Section 810 of the bill, which is yet another Republican ideological rider. I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege and recognize our colleague, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents this great District of Columbia. She represents this district as an advocate, as a legislator, as a leader, and it's really good to see you here tonight. Thank you, Congresswoman Norton.
Give her a round of applause. Thank you, Eleanor.
Now, this policy rider, which would ban federal funds appropriated for the District of Columbia to pay for abortion services, it's really a clear violation of the district's home rule and is really dangerous to the health of women in the district. And year after year, I have stood in this committee, along with our ranking member, to highlight just how detrimental this policy rider really is. Now, no other jurisdiction or state is told how to use its own locally raised revenue, yet this committee is preparing once again to vote to force Congress's views on the District of Columbia. And I just ask, would you want myself or anyone on our side of the aisle or on your side of the aisle to interfere in your congressional district with your local government to come up with legislation to limit their ability to use its funds the way they so choose? I don't think so. We should never be in the business of denying a woman's reproductive health coverage, a full range of reproductive health coverage, because of her race or ethnicity, source of insurance, income, or where she lives. That is exactly what this policy rider does. The rider specifically targets women of color and low-income women in this district. In fact, 93% of Washingtonians whose access to abortion care is restricted by this ban are women of color. That's a fact. And we know that a woman who seeks an abortion but is denied is more likely to fall into poverty than one who is able to get an abortion. But that's not even the issue on this bill. The issue is the district's right to use its own local funds in the way they so determine is appropriate. Now, we already know that since 1973, the terrible Hyde Amendment has prohibited the use of federal funds to provide or promote abortion services. My personal view is that the Hyde Amendment should be overturned. But the unfortunate fact of the matter is that the removal of the D.C. abortion ban would not alter the current prohibition against federal funding of abortion services. So I hope you support this amendment. Once again, this committee has no need and no reason to interfere in the district's decisions in terms of how they want to spend their local dollars. This has nothing to do with federal funding.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Chairman Graves.
Mr. Chairman, committee, I rise in opposition to the amendment, not because it was something I inserted, but in fact, this provision has been in law for 21 years. 21 years. So this poison pill rider signed into law by Bill Clinton is still in effect today, and it's been in law ever since, with exception of 1 year. So with that, I ask you to oppose the amendment and continue the good policies of the past, and let's continue forward.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Mr. Quigley is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of Ms. Lee's amendment and have been honored to do so in the past and will continue to do so. I also want to recognize Ms. Holmes Norton, who is still with us at this late hour, and commend her for her work. Unfortunately, my colleagues are conveniently states' rights and non-states' rights, depending on the issue, whichever one seems to work at the time. And unfortunately, I like my time here in the district. Other than Chicago, it's a great place to live. I'm not sure I'd want to live here, though, just because you're living in a state largely controlled by other people that you didn't elect, and that's simply not right in a democracy. I get it. We disagree on this issue, but this amendment would not affect the current ban on federal dollars being used for abortion services. Regardless of how you feel about the issue, those of us here on the Hill shouldn't be allowed to deny a woman's access to coverage for just because of where she lives, works, or insured. The reality is, by banning public funds for these services, we are in effect banning access to legal and constitutionally protected services. Having a right and being able to access that right are two very different things. That shouldn't be the case, and I support the lady's amendment.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Mr. Serrano is recognized.
Thank you. I had the privilege and the honor of chairing this subcommittee for some years. I was chairman and I was ranking member. During that time, we took step by step by step to get rid of all the riders that were placed on the District of Columbia. And it saddened me to see that little by little, they're all coming back now to haunt the district and to hurt the district. And what we need to understand here is something that it's the only time I, in the past, have raised my voice in this committee. And that's to say that a lot of people here, what they do in Congress is they don't deal with these issues back home. They deal with these issues in the District of Columbia. So when they're asked by a reporter, how are you on abortion? Oh, I'm against abortions. Where? Oh, in the District of Columbia. How are you on gun control? Well, I'm against any restrictions. Yeah, but you don't have restrictions in your neighborhood. Oh, no, I'm talking about the District of Columbia. And D.C. becomes this sort of playground for so many members of Congress to do what they shouldn't do. Now, we have a constitutional responsibility. We know that. But we don't have a constitutional abuse responsibility. The people of the District of Columbia have a right to self-government as much as is allowed under the Constitution. That's fine. I wish it was up to me. When I became chairman of the committee, I said, I'm the first member of Congress who's going to say the following: I don't want more power. When it comes to D.C., I want less power. Let them govern themselves. Let them rule themselves. And that's the way to do it. But what we're seeing here is not just this issue, Ms. Lee. It's just a return to those days when we told the District of Columbia everything that they had to do. That is wrong. As our leader of those years, Mr. Obey, Dave Obey, used to say, if you want to do this, there's a simple way of doing it. Just move to the district and run for the city council or for mayor, and then you can have all the power you want over the people in D.C., but not this way. This is wrong. This is not the way to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. Ms. Lee, you have the right to close.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just because this policy has been on the books for 25 years doesn't mean it's right. This committee has an opportunity to correct years of injustices. It doesn't make any sense that we would want to continue to interfere in a local government that spends its own revenue the way it so determines with their mayor and city council. Again, 93% of the women are women of color. This is a discriminatory rider. And you should be able to at least do the right thing today, correct these years of injustices, and vote for my amendment. Let's make sure that the District of Columbia understands that we do believe in home rule and that we do believe in their independence, and we do believe that they deserve the same respect and the same rights that we all want for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. The question is on the Lee amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it, and the amendment was not agreed to. Sufficient hands. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Ms. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen. No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera Butler. Ms. Herrera Butler, no. Mr. Jenkins? Mr. Jenkins, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy? Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Meng? Ms. Meng, aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, nay. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, nay. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Roybal Allard? Ms. Roybal Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor, no. Ms. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no.
Are there any members who wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing no one standing, the clerk will tally. Yeah, we ran out of pads. On this vote, the yeas are 23, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to.